I never thought I'd be the type of person to seek revenge. I always believed in fairness, in karma, in letting life take care of things on its own. But life doesn't always work that way, does it? Sometimes people get away with things they shouldn't, and if you don't stand up for yourself, you end up with nothing. That's what happened to me. My name is Claire, I'm 35, and this happened 3 years ago, when my grandfather passed away. He was the one person in my family who truly cared about me. My parents always favored my sister, Emily, the golden child. She was the perfect one, charming, successful, the one who could do no wrong. I was the afterthought. And when Grandpa died, she made sure I stayed that way. I didn't even realize something was wrong at first. I was grieving. My grandfather had been my safe place since I was a kid. He taught me how to fish, how to fix things around the house, how to negotiate a good price at a flea market. More than anything, he taught me my worth, something my own parents never did. So when the will was read, I was too numb to process it immediately. Grandpa had always told me he wanted me to have the house, the one place I'd ever felt at home. He knew Emily didn't care about it. She lived in a sleek penthouse downtown, paid for by her rich husband. And yet somehow the will said otherwise. Everything. The house, his savings, even his old car. It was all hers. At first I thought I had misunderstood. Maybe Grandpa had changed his mind. Maybe I had just imagined all those conversations where he reassured me that the house would be mine. But something felt off. Emily barely looked surprised. In fact, she was smug. My parents, of course, didn't question a thing. "Your sister will take good care of it," my mother said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. But I knew Emily. She didn't care about the house. She only cared about what it was worth. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. I started digging. I requested a copy of the will and compared it to an older version I had once seen in Grandpa's study. And there it was, the signature. It wasn't right. Grandpa had a distinct way of writing his G, a little loop he'd done his whole life. The new will didn't have it. I took it to a lawyer, who confirmed my suspicions. The document had likely been altered. But proving it in court? That was another story. I'd need money for legal fees, and even then, forgery cases were tricky. Emily had always been 2 steps ahead, and she knew I didn't have the resources to fight her. That's when I realized, if I couldn't take back what was mine directly, I'd make sure she regretted taking it in the first place. Emily had always lived like money grew on trees. She married rich, she spent rich, but she wasn't rich. Not really. Her husband, Daniel, was the one with the deep pockets, and from what I knew, he wasn't exactly the generous type. He controlled the finances, gave her an allowance like she was a teenager. That was my first clue. Emily might have had Grandpa's house and savings, but she wasn't as untouchable as she wanted everyone to believe. She depended on appearances, on maintaining this image of effortless wealth. And if there's one thing I knew about her, it was that she would rather die than let people see her struggle. So I started small. I knew her weaknesses, the little cracks in her perfect life. I spread a rumor, casually of course, through an old friend of ours who still ran in her social circle. "Did you hear Daniel's company isn't doing so well?" I asked over drinks, planting the seed. It didn't matter if it was true or not. In their world, perception was everything. A few weeks later, I noticed the shift. Emily started selling things, designer handbags, jewelry, even her ridiculous collection of imported wines. She was liquidating assets. That's when I knew I had her. She was panicking, and panicked people make mistakes. The next step was the house. Emily had never intended to live in Grandpa's home. She saw it as a quick sale, an easy way to pocket some cash. But I knew how to stall things. I started dropping by unannounced, reminding her that I still had things there. Old boxes, sentimental items, things she couldn't legally throw out without risking a fight. Every time she tried to list it, I made sure something got in the way. A sudden plumbing issue? I called the city to report it. Mysterious noises in the attic? I made sure a neighbor mentioned it to the wrong person. I even had an exterminator friend find termite damage that would take months to resolve. The house became a money pit instead of a payday, and with every delay, Emily got more desperate. But I wasn't done. I knew Emily had never managed money well. She lived off her husband, but she also had a secret, one she thought no one knew. Credit cards. She had them hidden, separate from what Daniel controlled, and I knew just how to make that problem worse. A few carefully timed tips to debt collectors, a whisper to a mutual acquaintance about her reckless spending. Soon enough, her accounts started getting flagged. She wasn't just struggling, she was drowning. And the best part? She couldn't tell anyone. She'd spent her entire life building this image of perfection, of success. Admitting she was in trouble would be worse than losing everything. Emily started to unravel. It wasn't obvious at first. She still held her head high, still showed up to charity events and designer boutiques like nothing was wrong. But I knew her too well. The tension in her shoulders, the way she gripped her phone like she was waiting for bad news, and then the cracks widened. A friend of hers mentioned that Emily had started canceling plans, dodging expensive outings. She said she wasn't feeling well, they laughed, but I could hear the doubt in their voice. Emily never turned down an opportunity to show off. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. One afternoon, my phone buzzed, and there it was, her name on the screen. I let it ring, just long enough to make her sweat, before I picked up. "Claire," she said, her voice tight, controlled. "I need to talk to you." I could hear it. She was desperate, though she'd rather eat glass than admit it outright. I made her wait a little longer before I agreed to meet, not at some trendy cafe or a high-end restaurant, but at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, a place where no one she knew would see her. If Emily was coming to me for help, I wanted her to feel every inch of that humiliation. When I walked into the diner, she was already there, sitting in the corner booth, sunglasses on like some kind of washed-up celebrity. She looked thinner, her usual confidence worn down into something that almost resembled vulnerability. Almost. I slid into the seat across from her and waited. She hated silence, hated when she wasn't the one in control. Sure enough, she cracked first. "I need a loan," she said, like it was a casual request, like we were sisters who actually helped each other. I nearly laughed. Instead, I raised an eyebrow. "A loan?" I repeated, making her say it again, making her choke on the words. She cleared her throat, gripping her coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her steady. "Just until things settle. Daniel's been difficult. And the house isn't selling as fast as I'd hoped." There it was. The cracks had finally split wide open. I leaned back, savoring the moment. "That's tough," I said, my voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But you know, money's tight for me too. After all, I didn't get an inheritance." She flinched. Just for a second, but I caught it. She knew exactly what I was doing, but she was out of options. That's what made it so delicious. She exhaled sharply, her manicured nails tapping against the table. "Claire," she tried again, her voice softer, almost pleading. "I know things between us have been strained, but we're family." I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. "Family?" I echoed. "That's interesting, because when Grandpa died, you didn't seem to care much about that." Her face darkened, the charm slipping. "I needed that money," she snapped. "You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, leaning forward. "I understand that you stole from me, that you forged his signature, that you thought you could get away with it." I let the words sink in, watching her grip tighten on her coffee cup. Then I smiled. "And I understand that now. You need me." Silence. For the first time in her life, Emily didn't have a comeback. Emily's jaw tightened, her pride warring with her desperation. I could see it in her eyes, the battle between wanting to maintain control and the sinking realization that she had none. She wasn't used to being on this side of the power dynamic, but she had no choice. "How much do you want?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I almost laughed at the irony. Even now, she thought this was just another transaction, another deal she could buy her way out of. I shook my head slowly. "It's not about money, Emily," I said, keeping my voice calm, measured. It's about setting things right. She scoffed, rolling her eyes, trying to regain some of her usual arrogance. Oh, please, she muttered. Don't act like you're some kind of saint. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You're right, I admitted. I'm not, but I am someone who knows exactly how much you need me right now, and that means I set the terms. I could see the anger flash across her face, but she bit her tongue. For once, she wasn't in control. She exhaled sharply, staring down at the table before finally looking up at me. What do you want? She asked, the words strained, like they physically hurt her to say. I smiled. First, I want the house, I said, watching her stiffen. Sign it over to me. No arguments, no stalling. You never wanted it anyway. She clenched her jaw but didn't object. We both knew she had no choice. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. And? I tapped my fingers against the table, drawing out the moment, making her squirm. Second, I continued, you tell Mom and Dad the truth, the real truth, about the will, about what you did. Her nostrils flared. Are you serious? She hissed. You want me to humiliate myself? I tilted my head. I want you to take responsibility, I corrected. And finally, you disappear. No more calls, no more favors. You live with the choices you made. Emily stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the wheels turning, the calculations, the desperation. Then, finally, she gave a slow nod. I half expected her to fight me on it, to throw one last tantrum, but she didn't. She just sat there, swallowing her anger like a bitter pill. I could see the exact moment she realized she had no other way out. Fine, she said, voice tight. I'll sign over the house. I nodded, but I wasn't done. And the confession? I pressed, watching her shift uncomfortably. That was the part that would hurt her the most, not losing the house, not even losing the money, but admitting to our parents that she wasn't perfect, that she had cheated, lied, stolen. Her image was everything to her. But the beauty of it was, she had no leverage anymore. The meeting with the lawyer happened the next day. Emily barely spoke, just signed where she was told, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the deed. It was done. The house was mine, just like Grandpa had wanted. But the real victory came later that night. Our parents were furious. Not at her, surprisingly, but at me. They had spent years making excuses for Emily, enabling her, pretending she was flawless. Even as she stood there, admitting to everything, my mother's face twisted with disbelief. She was grieving, she tried, her voice sharp. She wasn't thinking straight. I laughed, shaking my head. No, Mom, she was thinking just fine. Emily didn't bother defending herself. Maybe she knew it was pointless, or maybe she was just too exhausted to keep up the act. Either way, she stood there, arms crossed, letting our parents fumble for excuses. It was almost funny, watching them struggle to reframe everything, to paint her as the victim. But I wasn't interested in their pity, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let them twist this into another story where Emily came out looking innocent. You always protected her, I said, my voice calm but firm. Even when she didn't deserve it. Even when she stole from me. My father let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. Claire, do you really think this is worth tearing the family apart? That made me laugh, a sharp, bitter laugh. Tearing the family apart? I echoed. That happened the second she forged Grandpa's will. My mother flinched like I had slapped her. Enough, she snapped. You got the house. Isn't that enough for you? I let the silence stretch before answering. You know what? Yeah, it is. I grabbed my bag, ready to leave them with whatever version of the truth they wanted to believe. Emily had already checked out of the conversation, her head down, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to disappear. For the first time in her life, she had lost, and I was done. Walking out of that house felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd been forced to wear my whole life. The weight of years of neglect, of favoritism, of being the afterthought, it all peeled away with every step I took toward my car. I had the house. I had the truth. And most importantly, I had my freedom. Emily never reached out after that. Not a single text, not a phone call, nothing. I'd like to say I missed her, that some part of me mourned the loss of my sister. But the truth? I felt relief. She had spent her whole life taking from me attention, affection, even my inheritance. But this time she had nothing left to take. The house needed work, of course. After everything I'd done to stall the sale, it was ironic that I now had to undo the damage. But every repair, every coat of paint, every piece of furniture I restored felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. Grandpa had left this place for me, and now, finally, it was mine. As for Emily, well, I heard through the grapevine that things only got worse for her. Without the house money, she had to rely on Daniel, and he wasn't as patient as she'd hoped. Last I heard, she was living in some cramped apartment after he cut her off completely. I wonder if she ever thinks about what she did, if she regrets it. But honestly, I don't care. I wish I could say my parents came around, that they finally saw things for what they were, but that would be a lie. To them, I was the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who couldn't just let things go. I stopped waiting for their approval, stopped hoping they'd wake up one day and realize how much they had failed me. Instead, I built my own peace. The house became my sanctuary. I restored Grandpa's old study exactly the way he had it, down to the cluttered desk and the half-fixed clock on the shelf. Every time I sat in that room, I could almost hear his voice, telling me I'd done the right thing, that I had fought for what was mine, that I had won. One evening, months later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the best of me. "Claire," a familiar voice said. It was Emily. I could hear the hesitation, the shame, the undercurrent of something I never thought I'd hear from her. Defeat. She hesitated. "I just wanted to say, never mind." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for a long moment, then set it down. Whatever she had been about to say, it didn't matter. I had already moved on. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for an apology. I didn't need one. I had already gotten my revenge, and the best part? I never had to lift a finger.